Okay, welcome everyone to the July 2017 Women in Technology virtual group session. I am your host, Ree Irish. I run most of these. Every once in a while, my co-leader, Kathy Kellenberger, handles the honor. She does our newsletter every month, and she helps plan the WIT luncheon that happens in Seattle at our big conference. So she has other responsibilities. SentryOne, it happens to be a coincidence, but SentryOne is our generous sponsor of the WIT virtual chapter, and we present one attendee each month with a $50 Amazon gift card, but it happens to be a coincidence that Melissa Coates now works for SentryOne. So thank you. Double thank you, Melissa. So check out PaaSwit in all the different locations that you can find us. We're on YouTube. You can actually just Google PaaSwit. You don't have to worry about the link there. Check out our homepage, wit.sequelpaas.org. There's a lot of information there, a lot of resources. We highlight every upcoming women's session that's being presented in the SQL community that we can find. If you join our virtual chapter, you get the monthly newsletter. And if you do get the monthly newsletter and you find something that you think other people would be interested in reading, send it to us. You can email us, you can tweet it at us, or use the hashtag, and we'll include it in the newsletter if it's appropriate to share with the group. So I follow the hashtag PaaSwit all the time. I use the hashtag PaaSwit all the time to highlight what's going on in our community. So this past Saturday was SQL Saturday Atlanta. I run that. We had 15 women speakers at SQL Saturday Atlanta. And we didn't set out to go, let's see how many women we can get. We had a strong field of women that submitted. But that being said, we had 15. Columbus has 9. And because they're a smaller event, it's actually a greater percentage. So I think they're 30% women. I'm so proud of Dave Maxwell and the work he's done in Columbus. But that's this coming Saturday coming up, and Omaha as well. And then next weekend is Baton Rouge. They have a lot of sessions by women in Baton Rouge. Luckily, several of us are presenting multiple times, and there are multiple sessions in Albany that next weekend as well. Upcoming webinars, of course, today's Melissa Coates, and we changed the title of that months ago. I didn't think to change the slide. I'm sorry about that, Melissa.
That's all right.
Andrea Masher is going to be doing our session, He's Assertive, She's Aggressive, and it's related to unconscious bias in the workplace. She'll be doing that in September. And Chrissy Lemaire will be doing Creating and Maintaining Successful Open Source Projects for us in October. I am still shopping for someone to present for us in August. I'd love to find an Intro to Power BI session, Melissa. So if you have a session that you could recommend for me for August, I'd love to go talk to that speaker.
Okay.
So today she's actually going to talk about tales from building a SQL Server data warehouse in Azure. And as I mentioned, she's a business intelligence architect for SentryOne. Now, do you live in Charlotte, Melissa?
I do.
Wasn't sure if I knew you lived in the Carolinas. I wasn't exactly sure where. Do you go into the office for SentryOne?
3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Nice. I'm so jealous. So, I love that. Melissa is ridiculously proud to be an IT geek. I don't think it's ridiculous. If you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and turn presenter over to you. I'll let you know. I should have let you know earlier. I will monitor the questions, and if it's a question that I can hold to the end, I will. If it's a question I think probably should be answered on the slides you're currently on, are you okay with me going ahead and asking you that?
Go for it.
Awesome. Okay. And then in case I forget to tell you later, ladies and gentlemen, I will be contacting one of you to let you know that you have won an Amazon gift card from SentryOne. And we're, again, genuinely pleased at what SentryOne does for the PaaSwit community in SQL. So I'm so proud of them as a company. So, Melissa, I will let you take it away, and I will remember to mute myself.
Sounds good. And here's your reminder to record us as well, if you haven't done that already.
I did start the recording, so hooray.
Good girl. Well, hi, everybody. Hope you're having a good day. As Ree said, my name's Melissa Coates, and I'm with SentryOne. I also have a blog at SQLchick.com. And if you would like a copy of these slides, there is a presentations and downloads page where you can find this towards the top of that page. So what we want to talk about today is Azure, and more specifically, how we went about recently migrating our data warehouse. So really this session is about just sharing some of the decisions we made, some of the things that we learned along the way, and it's not really a session intended to dictate this is how you should do things, more just a sharing of experiences. So what I'm going to do is start with just a couple quick concepts, just in case, and we're going to spend a good bit of time on the decision between running SQL Server in an Azure VM versus a couple of other choices in terms of SQL database or SQL data warehouse. Where we're going to also spend a good bit of time is talking about building out the environment, and then we'll just wrap up with, hopefully we'll have a few minutes left for Q&A at the end. As you can expect, this is a really wide topic to begin with. I really have a knack for choosing those. So there's a lot of pieces that are out of scope. So I've tried to target some of the things where I spent more time than I expected, or we kind of had round one that we said, you know what, let's do this a little differently. And so I chose to share things like that. So first, just a couple of definitions. So the thing that I want to start with is, you might hear the term ARM or Azure Resource Manager. We'll hit that just briefly at the end, but you can think of that as the underpinnings of what's in Azure. And a couple of concepts that are really, really key to know is a resource group. And we'll talk more about it in a minute, but for the moment, you can think of it as a collection of resources. And by a resource, what I mean are the services or the things you deploy in Azure. So a resource is that virtual machine, or is that SQL database, etc. And so typically each resource group contains quite a few resources. So we'll come back to this in a minute, but I wanted to introduce a couple of things there in terms of terminology. On the right side here, there's actually two pieces of our architecture that I'm going to talk about. We actually have a few more things in our architecture, but I'm going to narrow it down to two pieces. And one of them that I'm going to talk about here is a SQL Skills partnership that we have currently, where it's kind of depicted at the top right here. They have a weights library if you've never visited it. Paul Randall has a nice page devoted on his website per weight type with a description of what this weight means, what you might want to do about it, etc. And so what we recently did is we took some of our customer data and introduced some visuals into those weights. And so that particular piece has its own resource group in Azure. It has an Azure SQL database and it has a web app, and they all reside in the same resource group. And that's actually really important. Planning for these resource groups is really important, not only because it's a good way to organize your resources, but it's also a good way to secure them, assign permissions, especially if you're decentralized in some capacity. And you can even set policies per resource group. So for instance, if I'm not the co-owner of the subscription, but I have less responsibilities, perhaps someone wants to dictate, I can only provision an Azure SQL database that is up to a certain level of cost, and the rest of them are prohibited from me doing so in a self-service manner. We can do those sorts of things with policies. So one of the lessons that we learned is more narrow than broad, and to select the region carefully, and we'll talk more here about region in just a moment. In Azure, there's another concept that you'll hear, and particularly if you start doing some investigation on certain things, storage versus compute. So a lot of services have the concept of both. So in the middle, right next to each line, something like SQL Data Warehouse, SQL Database, they have storage, as in it stores data, and it also has the concept of compute, as in it runs jobs and so forth. There's other services that are really just compute services, and there's other things that are just storage only. And to what extent those are decoupled from each other really affects some of your flexibility. So that's a good concept to be aware of. The other thing that I'll briefly introduce, just in case anybody here is pretty new to the world of Azure, is we've got the concept of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So at the bottom left, what we've had for years and years and years is our physical servers and even our virtualized environments. And those are usually our own dedicated infrastructure for which we have complete control over. As we move up into the top side of this chart above the line in the middle, and we move into the public cloud in Azure, the first step is what we call infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, and that would be the exact same thing as your virtualized server, just sitting in Microsoft's data center. The next step up we call platform as a service, and examples of that would be Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Data Warehouse, which we're going to talk both about those here in just a moment. And the last one at the top right, we call software as a service, and an example of that is Power BI. And being at the top right, it has less knobs and whistles for you to adjust and control as we go up towards the top right. But usually scalability goes up and cost goes down. So you have all of these trade-offs as you make decisions on how you want to deploy your infrastructure. And then just for completeness, the last piece sort of on the bottom right is Azure Stack. And that's more of a private cloud environment. And Microsoft just recently gave us some more guidance on how that's going to work. And it's rather than software, it's going to be some hardware that you purpose purchase so that you can basically run services like an Azure SQL database. Maybe you love everything about that service, but you can't use the public cloud. You instead want to run it inside your own data center. And so that's what the Azure Stack delivery is intended to target. So next I want to talk about our three choices for if we want a traditional SQL database or SQL data warehouse environment. I am a BI and analytics person, so I was deploying a data warehouse. A whole lot of these concepts that we're going to talk about obviously also are applicable to an OLTP system, and when they're not, I'll call them out. So our first choice is SQL Server and a VM. So that was that first choice above the line in that last diagram. And here's where, because we're just running good old SQL Server that we're all familiar with, we've got SSIS, AS analysis services, RS reporting services, and so forth. We've got the whole stack of SQL Server. And that changes as soon as we move to the right in this diagram. So our next choice is Azure SQL Database. And we have two choices now. Non-managed on the left side of the middle here is what we've had for some time now. And although in Azure there is a SQL Server associated with the database, it's really not the same. And so really you can think of Azure SQL Database in this traditional concept as being a bit of an isolated database. And because it's been isolated, there's instance level features that have not been available. Things like agent jobs, things like cross database queries. There's a number of them that have prohibited certain customers from migrating to it. So a new offering that is still in preview right now is what they're going to call managed instances. And it's still a PaaS service. However, it's going to have much closer feature parity to SQL Server. And in fact, I have not seen a list of what's not supported. So I think it's going to be a pretty short list of what's not supported. Finally, we have Azure SQL Data Warehouse. This guy is where we're talking about larger scale data warehousing workloads on an MPP architecture, which stands for massively parallel processing. We'll elaborate on that here in just a second, but do keep in mind that that's your larger scale environment. So the first choice is really best for if you want to pick up an existing solution and migrate it as is, and you want to run any software. So for instance, integration services, it has no correlating PaaS service in Azure. So you really have to run it either on premises or in an Azure VM as of today. And really, if you have the DBA staff in-house and you really want to administer all of those aspects, because as we move to the right, a lot of those underpinnings are managed more by Azure. So that is a pro to a lot of companies, and that's a con to some companies too, depending on the talent that you have in-house. For Azure SQL Database, this is probably what you want to look at if you have a brand new database solution. And recently, the max size of it moved from 1 terabyte up to 4 terabytes. So if we're talking about a data warehouse, the rule of thumb here is if your size currently is well under 4 terabytes, this would be a good solution to look at. Now, an OLTP workload can do certain things like sharding across the databases and doing some techniques that are not appropriate for a data warehouse workload. So that 4 terabyte limit really, for all practical purposes, only applies to more of a data warehouse workload as opposed to a transactional system workload. So here you've got that reduced administration of things like the operating system and high availability and disaster recovery, et cetera, et cetera. So that leaves Azure SQL Data Warehouse on the right. So that's our larger data volume. There is no written absolute minimum to say this is where you should start looking into it. Under a terabyte, it really doesn't make sense at all. And really up into the 2-3 terabyte range, it doesn't make as much sense unless you know about future growth or unless you need things like Polybase integration with the data lake. There's certain other things that could make it make sense, especially if you know your data volume is going to grow. It's also got more capability to scale up and down or even pause it than something like Azure SQL Database does. So it's got more of that decoupling between compute and storage that we mentioned earlier. So I do want to elaborate just a minute on this idea that SQL Data Warehouse is a different creature. So this idea of MPP architecture is depicted here on the left, where we have a control node at the top, and you can think of him as the brains. And then we have 3 compute nodes in the middle, but it could be more or it could be less, and that introduces the idea of scalability. Now, you don't actually say, I want 3 compute nodes. You define it by these data warehouse units, which are the equivalent in Azure SQL Database to DTUs, the transaction units or throughput units. There's never much agreement on what it really means. So if you scale up your compute nodes, obviously you have more horsepower and more distributed pieces in order to process across the MPP architecture. And because we've got all these separate compute nodes, they refer to that as a shared nothing architecture, which really just means that the nodes have their own disk memory and CPU. So the thing to know about this is that on very small data volumes, all of this distributed architecture, you're going to pay a performance penalty to, if you can envision splitting up the data, running it separately, and then combining it again to return the results. So that's why we talk about it being larger scale. And then the other interesting thing about this, we can scale it up. For instance, maybe I've got a really big job at 1 a.m. I can scale up my DWUs, run that job, and scale it back down. So I'm not overpaying for infrastructure to sit there 24/7 when I only need it at certain times. And then the other thing I can do is pause. So let's say theoretically, you need your SQL data warehouse up for 5 days around the end of the month, or maybe nobody uses it over the weekend, that sort of thing. So if you pause it, basically you can envision that there's no compute nodes sitting there in the middle. So gray them out in your mind. And the data storage, because it's decoupled, it's safe, it's sitting there until you restart it up and define what the scale should be when you start it back up. Not all features that we would expect in SQL Server world are available in Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So certain things like all pieces of SQL or Transact SQL are not supported. Most specifically, the merge statement is kind of a big one. There's not a SQL Server database project that is supported. There are a couple of workarounds though. And things like cross-database queries, those aren't supported and so forth. The big thing to know though is that you want to be prepared for this idea of different data loading patterns. And what I mean by that is we have Polybase that can be used in two ways. One is to essentially reach into something like blob storage or the Azure Data Lake to retrieve data. The other thing we use Polybase for is to actually load data. And if you can think about this conceptually, if we use Polybase, that control node, we don't have to go through it, which he's kind of a bottleneck since there's just one of him. And Polybase allows us to go essentially straight to the compute nodes, and that gives us greater parallelism with our data loads. The reason that's important is if we just take an existing SSIS package and we instead repoint it to the data warehouse, it's all going to go through the control node, and you're not going to get parallelism like you're expecting. You're not basically going to get all of the benefit that you would otherwise be with an MPP system. The other thing is because there's no merge support, you might have to rewrite some of your ETL. And there's different approaches, and there's a couple of really good resources online to get you started there, but just know that there's probably some refactoring that is going to happen if you're thinking about a migration. The other thing that's really important is the distribution keys. So that basically means you have to know your data really well so that you define a distribution key for every table that avoids things like data skew and unnecessary data movement. So those are really important concepts in SQL DW to educate yourself about before going there. And last but not least, because a clustered column store index is there by default in SQL DW, really that means that our traditional data warehousing environment of a denormalized data model or a star schema is exactly what a data warehouse like this is looking for, as opposed to let's just copy all of our OLTP normalized tables, put a copy over in SQL DW and issue queries there. That's not going to utilize the system for what it's really made for. Okay, so what did we do? We said we already have integration services. We already have analysis services that's only in multidimensional mode. There is an analysis services PaaS service. Currently, it supports tabular models. So actually, as of right now, we're planning on migrating, but we haven't done it yet. We also have master data services and our services, both of which require SQL Server. So we said, okay, we need a VM for basically bullets 2 through 5 on that list. So we said, let's let the data warehouse run in a VM environment as well for right now.
So I'm sorry, Melissa, I'm gonna interrupt. And if you're gonna answer this, great. Or if you want to wait till the end of the slide, I have 2 questions here. That's why I wanted to. How do you get the Azure subscription without giving any credit card details?
I don't think you can. So if there's a way to do that, I'm not aware. I have a couple of subscriptions. One's work-related, one's not. My one that's not work-related that I don't pay for, I still had to put in a credit card. So I'm not aware of a way around that.
Okay. Second question, are SQL Agent and Resource Governor available in Azure?
That would be yes if you're using a virtual machine for SQL Server. So basically this left item, which is an IaaS environment, or if you're using the new Azure SQL database that's called a managed instance. So that one's still in preview, but there are a couple of blog posts out there. If you search for Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, you'll find that. And so depending on what you're looking for, you might even get involved with the private preview and that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you. I will let you go back to your
Sure. No, good questions. So for Azure SQL Database, we had that SQL Skills implementation that I spoke about a couple minutes ago. So because that was brand new, and it's really a subset of some data from our bigger data warehouse, we said that's a great use case for Azure SQL Database. So that's where we introduced that. And at this point, we put the SQL DW on our roadmap. Because we don't really have the data volume right now today. We think we will. And we're also, it's very out of scope for today's conversation, but we're also building a data lake. And so we think that future data volume with the integration with the data lake is going to make perfect sense. However, due to the refactoring and other things that we talked about, we said we need to really do this strategically. So that's on our roadmap. I'll be really excited if we have that migration done in the next year, but we shall see. So what that means for our current state is, you've already seen the diagram at the bottom right. That's the PaaS piece. Up at the top left, the IaaS piece. So we've got two virtual machines. So the virtual machine on the left, which would be, let me show you where I'm pointing at here. This one right here. We are running in enterprise mode. So we've got integration services, analysis services, multidimensional, and master data services. And then our VM number 2 is running analysis services. So very much kind of a typical business intelligence design here, where then the reporting from users is going through the analysis services box, at least in most cases. By the end of this presentation, you are going to know what all this stuff here about the storage account that's attached to the VM means. So sit tight on that. So that's current state. Where I want this to go in terms of future state is essentially reduce VM number 1 to just the pieces that I need, which would be in integration services and master data services. And I want to end up eliminating VM2 in favor of Azure Analysis Services as soon as we have the ability to migrate the multidimensional over to tabular. And then I'm hoping that we end up with the Azure SQL Data Warehouse integrated with the data lake and so forth. So we have some plans here to reduce the use of VMs, but that's where we are today. So on this section, I just want to give you very, very quickly a few things, in almost a checklist, but not really, of things to think about when you're planning. So in terms of our goals and our requirements, we really wanted to support our future growth. And because this is the data warehouse, the analytics team, the BI folks, we need to be able to manage this independently, with the exception of things like networking and that sort of thing that our IT team handles. And because of the changes with SQL DW, we didn't really want to take on any of that refactoring right now. Another big thing, because of the nature of some of this data, and I know y'all can relate to this, is that we wanted to make sure that we can require a VPN for when we connect to the environment. And something like the virtual machine, we are currently requiring a VPN connectivity for that. My IT group all set that up. The PaaS service, so Azure SQL DB and DW, right now we cannot require a VPN for those. And the thing is, though, is that new managed instance for SQL DB is going to support the VPN. So we'll have some more capabilities there here soon. And acceptable performance of hourly ETL jobs. So our hourly ETL job runs fine, maybe a minute or two slower. It went from maybe 11 minutes to 13 minutes. And so that one we're okay with. We have one nightly job that actually is a for each loop, and it connects to a different database every time. And it has to loop through about 375 times. And so unfortunately, that one is much, much, much slower right now. So that's something we're going to have to address, but thankfully it's a nightly job, so we can get away with the fact that it's not performing as well. But the issue with that is that every time the for each loop runs, every time it makes that new database connection, it takes around 10 seconds. And because the for each loop is by nature sequential, that's why it's running so much longer, is that initial connection that when it was running on-prem, we didn't have that issue. So initial planning, it's all about trade-offs. So cost, performance, security, simplicity versus functionality. So I think as you go through not only planning, but the implementation, you're gonna definitely face that all the time. So licensing and additions, right? That's a really important thing. And that's no different than if you were gonna deploy SQL Server on-prem. Capacity planning and cost estimates. So there's a calculator online to help you plan for costs of resources. The thing is, though, is sometimes you also have something else. So if you can do a POC and then you can prove out, here's all the pieces I'm going to need start to end, that's a lot safer than kind of just guessing with the cost calculator. And compliance. So depending on obviously the extent of your compliance, that's getting better and better and better all the time in Azure across all the services. So there's a link here at the bottom right. The Trust Center has by service what's supported for in terms of compliance. So domain service accounts and credentials, exactly the same as you would have ever done when deploying SQL Server with our VMs. We have domain joined them. We're running the different service account per service, all that stuff that we've done forever. Back to the idea of resource groups. So if you're decentralized in some way, that's another thing to actually think about. And even further, what can be groups, what can be users, what has to actually be a service principal in Azure Active Directory and so forth. The region is really important. So certainly where the data comes from and where it goes from a geographic standpoint, but you might also want to think about where your users are at and be in closer proximity. You also, whenever you possibly can, you want to co-locate your related resources. So let's say I'm piping some data in from blob storage to my VM. Ideally, they're both in the exact same region. They don't have to be in the same resource group, but ideally the same region or close-ish, and that would minimize data egress charges, because you can always put data into Azure. As soon as it comes out of Azure or out of that data region, data egress charges apply, although they are dirt cheap. Latency obviously applies for region, and things like backups and recovery. Where are you going to put primary versus secondary type of items? And last but not least, every single service or resource is not available in every region. So that's really important to kind of plan out if you know a list, and then start from the data region you want. So for instance, a lot of our stuff for real is in East US 2, because there's a couple of services that we're not talking about today that aren't actually available in East US. So also, although Microsoft's mantra is cloud first, which usually means Azure SQL Database gets the feature before full-fledged SQL Server does, there's really some things that are not available in Azure SQL Database. So there's a list here, and there's a link here for what's supported in terms of a side-by-side chart, and goes into quite a bit of detail. So so that can be a huge consideration in terms of your planning exercise. Lastly, what migration method you want to use. So just, a trivial little thing to decide, right? Because it's a data warehouse, and because it's not a very close to real-time data warehouse, we were able to utilize a very simple backup and restore approach. So many of you wouldn't be able to get away with something quite so simple, and in which case I'm sorry, but we were able to get away with a pretty simple approach for our SQL Server environment, and there's tons more. There's also a brand new data migration service that was just announced at Build, so you might look into that as well as some of these other more traditional options. So structuring dev, test, and prod. So the first approach that we took is to separate it out by subscription. So we have dev, test, prod subscription, and then we within dev, for instance, let's say we have an internal reporting resource group and that SQL Skills Weights resource group among other resource groups devoted to other teams, and there exist in each of the three environments as you would expect as we go through the environments for deployments. So the nice thing is there is a real clear, easy separation of what's prod and what's not. Problem with that is that I'm an administrator of this environment, but I'm not a co-owner at the subscription level, because in the dev subscription, that's for absolutely everybody in SentryOne. So what I was able to be was the owner of a resource group. However, that meant sometimes, yes, if I'm saying I want to create a new resource and add it to this resource group, sometimes Azure allowed me to, and sometimes I did not have permission to, and I had to go find a co-admin and have them add this thing for me. And that also introduced the need for the VPN setup and so forth to be done 3 times across the subscriptions. And then we also found ourselves making our naming convention a little bit more explicit in order to, basically we put a prefix on a lot of things. You could tell what team it belonged to just by the name and so forth. So where we ended up with is there's 4 teams at SentryOne that use Azure really significantly, and we're one of them. So we got our own subscription. And so now, what we're doing is we're dividing up dev, test, prod by resource groups. So the pros of that is, hey, I'm a co-admin of the subscription because that's now my boundary, and that means I can do anything I need to do. So my decentralized piece of it is much more inconvenient for me as that isolated admin, so to speak. A lot of the setup from a VPN standpoint was done just once, although to be fair, other teams need that sort of thing too. And then the billing is segregated to just our stuff, which is really, really nice. The con is just the inherent risk that, okay, everything is all together and we have to be particularly careful and use different IDs to make sure we do not inadvertently touch prod when we do not intend to. But other than that, this is working really well for us. Naming conventions. So this is another something that went through a couple of tries before I settled on something that I really like. Where I'm at now is the prefix is essentially the purpose, then the type of service, then the environment. So as an example, internal reporting is the purpose, RG is a resource group, and then dev, test, or prod is the suffix. Or at the bottom right, we've got the BI SQL VM data storage for dev, or the backup storage, or the diagnostics storage for dev. So it's working well. I like it. So the type of service in the name means that if I'm looking at some sort of logging data, I know what I'm looking at. The environment and the suffix, I actually had it, my first go around at the names was SQL VM Dev 1 or SQL VM Dev 2. And not that it's a big deal to concatenate in the middle, but I kind of like them as the suffix. Prod's enumerated now. Our first go around when prod was in its own subscription, I actually dropped the suffix completely. So it would have just been BI SQL VM1. Because they're all together, I think clarity is worth more, so that's why it's enumerated. No dashes, since all services don't allow them, and this is one I could go either way on, but if the service allows it, I do camel case, and if it doesn't, they're all lowercase. So for instance, storage at the bottom right, it actually does require all lowercase in the portal, but this is a little easier to read. So, but I could go with all lowercase all the time because they don't all allow it as well. So tags are really helpful as well. So currently we're using 3 standard tags shown on the right here, the screenshot. We've got a billing category, a environment type, and a support contact. So we've got one thing in our environment that is gonna get pushed to the support team. So in particular, the billing category is really helpful for breaking down billing costs. So if you have multiple, say, Azure Sequel databases, but you want to know really truly how much each one costs, or multiple storage accounts, that's how to get the breakdown on the invoices.
So Melissa,
okay.
I'm sorry, before
Yes.
you move on, and again, if you're going to answer this, are you going to be evaluating Azure Data Factory?
So we do have one thing that we're doing with Azure Data Factory. It's not really in scope for this particular presentation. However, I will say, because I guess I don't know specifically what the inquiry is about, but the thing I will say is don't think of it as SSIS for the cloud. It's more like some of SSIS control flow in the cloud. So if you're easily just copying some data from one environment to another, it's good for that. If you've got minimal transformations to do with the data, or you're okay with running things like stored procedures or Hive scripts or pig scripts, then it does a good job with that too. But it would not be an easy feat for us at all to take what we're doing in SSIS and just turn around and do it in Azure Data Factory. And the use case for it is not meant to be a full-fledged replacement for SSIS.
And then the next question before you move on is, would it make sense to use SSIS on an IaaS VM to get around the cross-database query limitation of an Azure SQL DB? I feel like I need to break that down into a few parts. Did that make sense?
Was the first place using IaaS, integration services?
Yes.
Oh, with different
SSIS on an IaaS VM.
I would think probably so, because with the VMs, you've got all the flexibility that you have with running it on-prem. So, the different connections that point to different destinations. So, but what comes to me though is each thing requires a connection usually. So you might be bringing both and kind of bringing them together in a merge of some variety. So I'm not sure I can answer that without quite understanding what they're trying to accomplish. But the answer is probably, right?
Okay.
A VM, you've got all your flexibility back.
Right. I will let you go ahead.
Okie doke. So Azure SQL Database. In this example, what I want to call out is that we have dev and we have prod. Since it's new and it's not undergoing a lot of changes, we actually don't have the third test environment for this right now. We'll introduce the one in the middle if we need it. But at the moment, the prod environment, it's scaled at an S2 in terms of billing, which that's shown where the red is in the middle of the screen. And right now our dev is sitting at an S0, which is really, really cheap. And we can change that obviously if we need to. The other thing that you need to know is about a firewall with Azure SQL Database. So the concept of a SQL Server when it comes to this is really just a container for one or more SQL DBs, kind of shown there at the top right. You can set a firewall, and by that I mean you have somebody that wants to query the SQL database, and even if it's sitting up there, and even if they have permission to read the data, until you open a firewall from that relates to the IP address they're coming from, they're not going to get in. So you can do that either at the server level, which is what's shown in the portal screen on the bottom left. So it's by far the easiest. Or more secure is you set it at the individual database level. So that you don't see in the portal, you'd have to issue T-SQL statements and do so inside the individual database, but it's more secure. If you are going to use the server level, at the bottom left there, these IPs are fake, but here's a range for the SentryOne office, and here's a one that, you know, could be my home computer, right? So the rule names that are auto-generated are not helpful, and it's actually really annoying to go in later and see 4 or 5 of them that are just junk, and I have no idea what they belong to. So give good names. For the VM, where I started with was the image that had SQL Server 2016 with Service Pack 1 installed. As you go through the portal for choosing, which in dev is for your first time provisioning, is perfectly acceptable. One of the options you have is for storage configuration. In my case, data warehousing was the appropriate choice, and what that does is it sets your stripe size on your disks to 256K instead of 64K, and it also sets a couple of trace flags in your SQL Server by default. There is this document online that's best practices for SQL Server in an Azure VM. A lot of the things on this page are pre-done in the image you start with, assuming that you choose to start with an image. Many of them are not, though, and they're documented here so that you are aware of it and you can take action and do that if you want to, right? So I visited that page a lot. It's really good. After I started with the VM image, right, I switched out those NT service accounts for our domain-based service accounts. I disabled unused services. If you remember, I've got 2 VMs and not everything really was needed on both, but yet a number of things come pre-installed, right? I changed out the whole disk structure, and I enabled disk encryption, which we'll talk about for a minute. Every database administrator has their handy dandy favorite list of things they want to set up on their SQL Server. So a number of things that I've got on my list too. Here's just a short list of the most important ones, but not planning to go into. Storage is a place where I spent more time than I expected. So in essence, the disks behind a virtual machine, shown at the bottom left here, are a VHD sitting in Azure Blob storage behind the scenes. So that's really cool, right? So you can actually go grab and download that VHD if you wanted to. What I did here, shown in the screenshot on the right, is this concept of pooling. So I've got 3 data disks there that are 3 files then that kind of relate down to 3 physical disks on the virtual machine. And I'll elaborate here in a moment on why I did that. So I'll come back to that in just a second. When you're choosing storage, and even right when you're provisioning the VM to begin with, it's going to ask you, do you want to use managed storage or unmanaged storage? The managed storage was released to preview smack dab when we were right in the middle of implementing a few months ago. And so I have not moved to it. And even just as recently as the last week or two, another feature came along to it. So I'm not 100% sure yet if they've reached feature parity yet. So what I have currently are 3 main sets of storage accounts associated with the VM. So one with that yellow, here, let me do this real quick here. I've got a backup storage account. So obviously that's my SQL Server backups. I've got the data and I've got the diagnostics or the logging data. Down here for the ones associated with the Azure SQL database, you can see here how I don't have one that's associated with the data because that's invisible to me. This is a PaaS service, right? So that's done by magic with Microsoft folks. You also get to choose premium or standard for your type of storage. Premium is the SSDs. Regardless of that choice, you definitely want to make sure that all of your data is in one single storage account so that you have a single recovery unit in case you need to in terms of failure. The other thing that I did, whoops, wrong button, sorry, is that URL that I showed you with best practices says do not set your storage for VMs to geo-redundant. So that's why the data and the diagnostics are set to LRS, which is locally redundant storage. And the backups, though, are set to read access geo-redundant storage, the RAGRS here, so that they're a little bit more safe in terms of redundancy there. Let's see here. Since it's about quarter till, I'm going to shorten the time that I'm talking on a couple of these things, but I do want to elaborate here a moment on this idea of storage spaces. So in Azure, when you're choosing standard or even premium, but especially standard, because I chose to use standard storage in dev and test because it's so much cheaper. So when you're choosing that, you've got for each disk the performance you're going to get. So let's say the disk gets 500 IOPS or 60 megabits per second throughput. So let's say that's not enough though, but I don't want to go up in size because I don't need more size in order to get better performance. So what I do is I take 3 data disks, I essentially pool them together and see, because those 3 are exposed to the VM as one virtual disk that I've mapped to the G drive, I've got 500 IOPS. So that's a really good way to increase your the performance aspects of your storage. Again, there's a trade-off there. I just increased my complexity for trying to keep my costs low. So let's see, these next several slides are just stepping through the steps that I did to implement that. So I'm actually going to skip past these because you can download the slides and run through them yourself. But essentially what I ended up with was my 3 volumes with the G and the L and the T. The other place where I spent a little more time than I expected was figuring out how I want to encrypt my data. So you've got the concept of storage service encryption. You've got disk encryption inside the VM, which is BitLocker if you're running Windows. And then you've also got the database level encryption like TDE or always encrypted. So, you know, that I can't tell you what the best choice is for you, right? So you've got a number of choices, and I have heard conflicting advice. I've had one person tell me, absolutely, do all 3. We've got enough compute these days. All 3 is perfectly acceptable and it can handle it. And I've had another very reputable expert say, no, pick one that meets your needs adequately and do that. So, so this is one of your planning decisions, but these are the choices that you have. And I'm gonna skip past these because it's just, again, a little bit of documentation for how to go about doing it. Once you enable disk encryption, which is, again, essentially the BitLocker, when you look at the disks associated with the VM in the portal, you'll see that, that they're enabled, and the handy dandy warning from the Azure Security Center will go away. If you recall, this is the BI team, the analytics team managing it, our disaster recovery. Here's where we kind of wish we were running PaaS so that this was more of the easy button, because we don't want to run an availability group. We don't want to make this a big deal. So in addition to documentation, we said, let's use premium storage in production. As of several months ago, if you had what they call a single VM that's not in an availability group, you had no SLA. But as of recently, now your SLA is, I believe it's 99.9 if you use premium storage, and then you have an uptime SLA. So we said, okay, that's worth it in production then. And I'm currently evaluating Azure Site Recovery, which is in preview at the moment. This is what our schedule looks like for production and then our dev and test environments. What's important here is that we run ETL during the business hours. So if you recall, we have 2 VMs, right? And the vast majority of our querying goes through VM2, which has analysis services. So that means I can shut down that SSIS VM from 9 p.m. through 6 a.m. so that, hey, that's a lot of hours per day, and that saves me a little over a third of the cost of the VM, because when the VM is shut down, and I don't mean shut down inside of Windows, I mean shut down according to Azure, that releases their compute resources, right? So I'm still paying for my storage, those VHDs sitting in Azure Blob Storage, but I'm not paying for compute anymore. How I'm doing that in Dev and Test, straight in the portal, there's a nice little feature that says, do you want to shut this down at a certain time per day? Absolutely. However, it doesn't have that's the easy button for Dev and Test, and that just means when we get in the morning and one of us needs it, we just fire it up manually. Production, that's not okay. So that's where Azure Automation comes in, where we've got the PowerShell script that says not only do you shut down at 9 p.m., you come back on at 6 a.m. Auto patching. So here's where the distinction between IaaS and PaaS starts to become muddy, because here we have a VM, but we're letting Azure implement the patching for both Windows and SQL Server. That might not be something that you're comfortable with. The thing to know is that if you enable this through the portal, what it does is it creates an account called the SQL IaaS extension, and that account gets administrative access on your SQL Server and on the Windows group. So, which makes sense, right? It needs permission to be able to do that, but that's how it's done. We have backups of each VM that are scheduled every night, and they are going to our recovery services vault. So once I implemented disk encryption, what that did in the recovery services vault user interface here is it then indicated that the backup was encrypted as well. In addition to those VM backups, I'm also doing nice tidy SQL backups. So that's where that BCK storage account came in that we talked about earlier. So again, that is something that I just went ahead and set up when I provisioned the VM. So you can see here, we've got a backup container. This is on the left here, and just normal old BAK files. So you can just go download them if you want to. The backups from SQL database, though, the PaaS service, we don't have nearly as much flexibility. So you can do full backups weekly, right? Differential every few hours, your transaction log every few minutes, depending on if you are paying for basic, standard, or premium, is how long it retains the backups. So most people probably want to keep a backup longer than 35 days, at least at maybe certain points in time. For longer term, you have a couple choices. You can set up your own process to back up the easy for me to say, the backpack file, which contains the schema and the data. Or you can look at that recovery services vault, which is in preview as well. So ARM templates are really important for deployments. So if you are interested in making your deployments repeatable and or interested in source controlling all of your Azure services, right? Infrastructure as code is the DevOps cool thing to do these days, right? So that's where ARM templates come in handy. So earlier I mentioned that a resource group, by default, it actually wants to deploy everything within a resource group as one unit. So you don't absolutely positively have to, but that's generally speaking the approach that you'll want to think about. So what I did is, at the bottom right's a link. I wrote a blog post called Getting Started with ARM, and I spoke to myself when I was getting started with ARM about maybe 6 or 8 weeks before I actually published the post. So I think that's useful, and so I'll avoid elaborating since we're almost out of time here. I will just mention that it's all JSON based, which is not scary once you get started with it. And there's a Visual Studio project, which is shown in that top middle screenshot. That's a little bit different structure that I set up that I like to work with. It's not quite how it comes out of the box, but I'd talk about all that in the blog entry.
So, Melissa, if you can, I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see if I can get them in an order that will flow from one to the other. Are extended events available in Azure DB and Data Warehouse?
Oh, I should know this. I should know this. I would have to check. I've been using our SentryOne monitoring tool, which of course uses a combination of things to pull the data out. So I haven't needed to go firsthand and dig through that. So I would have to check. I'm sorry, I do not know off the top of my head.
Okay. And what were the pushbacks that you faced when moving from on-premise to Azure?
I didn't really have any pushbacks since we want to get out of having as much on-premises infrastructure in our own data center. I was really encouraged to go that direction. So really for me, the obstacle was it took longer than I expected because I had some learning curves. But I don't have an enormously complex environment from a security standpoint, and other things like that that would cause certain groups in our org to squawk.
Okay, and any experience moving file stream over to Azure?
I do not.
Okay. And then finally, will the slides be available?
Absolutely. So I'll give you that URL here in just a second. It's at SQLchick.com on the presentations and downloads page.
Nice. I'll make sure that the PassWit account will tweet that as well today. Well, I'll find that link and tweet it.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. The last thing I want to mention is about monitoring, and this is also something that I wouldn't even consider is done. I'm gonna keep tweaking this for a while, but we have the concept of Azure Monitor, which offers a subset of functionality of OMS. So we've got the concept of metrics, activity logs, and diagnostic logs. And so on the left here, you can see that kind of pretty easy out of the box. Some of the things, the metrics that are exposed by Azure, you can basically just create a chart, pin it to your dashboard, and put it there. So that's pretty nice. There's also alerts. So there's a couple different kinds of alerts, and depending on the kind you're doing, the setup's a little bit different. Let me think, did I put yeah. So if you're using an activity log alert, and I got my fingers crossed this is gonna come for metric alerts soon, they have this concept of action groups. So I've got for production, I've got a critical and a standard. And if it's set to critical, that means I also get the SMS as well as an email, right? As opposed to just a standard alert, it's only going to be email. And that's really nice. And in this group, I set it only once. Whereas if I go back a page here, all of these metric alerts shown on the left, the email address it's defined in every single alert, which is really yucky, right? So I'm hoping that's something that becomes a little bit more cohesive here soon in Azure. For diagnostics, these look a little bit different depending on the service, but essentially for Azure SQL database, I'm sending the diagnostics to a storage account, and then we've got JSON data that I can do anything I want with. I've actually got the beginnings of a Power BI report that I had to, work with the data a little bit to turn the JSON into something useful. It wasn't too bad. And so I'm still working on that. There's also some auditing and threat detection type stuff that you can just turn on. You can enable it at the database level and at the server level, and also send it to blob storage. For the diagnostics for the virtual machine, even if you start from a SQL Server image, towards the top here, one of the things it will capture are actual SQL-oriented performance counters, but these are not on by default. You want to explicitly select them. So if you visit diagnostics and you turn this stuff on, just kind of visit each of the sections, but especially this one because it's not on by default. And then there's the Security Center. So it gives you lots and lots of warnings for things that it would suggest that you change about your environment, but you do have to specifically turn data collection on for it to fully do its thing. And finally, we're using my own. We're dog fooding, right? We do that an awful lot here at SentryOne to monitor the SQL Server and the Azure SQL database as well. So I will leave these key takeaways here on the screen, and I don't know if you have any other questions, Ree, that have come in?
I have one. Can you suggest some good resources for learning Azure?
Oh, wow. That sounds like a great blog entry. Because on one hand, there's so many things online, and I think probably what you're driving at is what's most well worth your time. So yeah, let me see if I can put something together on that that's a little bit more curated than what I would come up with on the top of my head.
So then if you ask that question or if you're interested in it, make sure you look at her blog. It's there on the screen, and follow her on Twitter. And Melissa, if you'll actually, when you do get that blog written, if you decide here's some stuff that's great, send me a message, let me know, and I'll try to share that information as well.
Sounds good. I'm writing it on my whiteboard, so that means I'll do it.
I was going to say, that makes it real. It's like my daughter.
That's real.
The calendar I keep for my daughter, if it goes up on that calendar, we are doing it.
There you go.
That's how it works. Okay. So you're all done? You're good?
I'm good.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much for presenting this today. I'm so glad. I contacted her months and months and months ago about doing this, and this is when worked for both of us. I really wanted you to do a session for us. So I'm pleased.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been great fun.
Awesome. So thanks, everybody. I'll have the recording up later today, and I've already tweeted the web link where you can find the slide deck when she gets that up. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day.